It's my pleasure to introduce Professor John de Caestecker, who's a consultant gastroenterologist and honorary professor in Leicester. John has had several very important posts and positions, including being BSG secretary, as well as chair of the BSG esophageal section. He's got a great interest in upper GI pathology and has led several multinational studies. And today he's going to talk to us about the ASPECT trial that was published in The Lancet.
Thank you very much, Rena. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay, that's the second one. Yes, so the ASPECT trial was published just over 2 years ago. It was something like 16 years from conception to completion, so it was a long haul. And many of you, I guess, will have been involved in it, either directly or you will know about it. So the main rationale for the ASPECT trial was, of course, could we prevent esophageal cancer in patients with Barrett's? And the rationale for this is that for epithelial cancers, inflammation is the main driver for cancer risk, also the same for Barrett's. PPIs reduce acid reflux and consequently reduce esophageal inflammation, but aspirin and non-steroidals also reduce inflammation more generally, and both therefore could be chemopreventative. However, it's all very well preventing cancer, but actually most patients with Barrett's don't die from esophageal cancer. In this study, we found a 5 times increased risk of dying from Barrett's in general, and of course esophageal adenocarcinoma was more than 20 times increased in men, about half that in women, but it very importantly showed that 5 times more patients numerically died from cardiorespiratory conditions than esophageal adenocarcinoma. So ASPECT was a pragmatic trial, and this was the reason we had a composite endpoint. So the composite endpoint was either death from any cause, or high-grade dysplasia, or esophageal adenocarcinoma, either high-dose PPIs versus low-dose PPIs, or aspirin versus no aspirin. The secondary objectives were to look at each of these separately for aspirin and high-dose PPI. And of course, the trial was powered for the primary endpoint, not the secondary. And also, we had to know that these treatments are safe. The other secondary endpoints I'm not going to discuss today. So the design was a factorial 2x2. That meant there were 4 groups, either low dose 20 milligrams esomeprazole with or without 300 milligrams of aspirin, or high dose 40 milligrams BD of esomeprazole with or without 300 milligrams of aspirin. In summary, over 2,500 patients were randomized. That was from 82 centres in the UK and 1 in Canada, and the follow-up was for nearly 9 years. We found more observed events than we needed for the primary endpoint, and the vast majority were in the ITT analysis. But we were very careful to make sure that adverse events were properly recorded. So I'm just going to run over very briefly the primary comparisons. This is event-free survival curve, so that means the curve on top has done worse because there were more events. And this is the PPI comparison. So on top is low-dose PPI versus high-dose PPI. And you'll see, looking at the p-value, that this is significant at the 5% level. For aspirin, you'll see that there was a divergence. No aspirin is the red on the top. And the diversion happens at about 4 years or so. I'll come back to that later. So although there was a difference, however, this was just failed to reach statistical significance. So there was a trend. However, if we censored for non-steroidal intake, so patients were not supposed to be on non-steroidal, but some of the ones who weren't on aspirin did take non-steroidals. So if we censored for those, as you can see from here, the aspirin primary analysis becomes just significant. If we look at the secondary endpoints, I'm not going to go in detail over this table. It is actually in the main publication, but just to point out that for PPI, the all-cause mortality remains significant. For aspirin, interestingly, high-grade dysplasia was just about significant. Not so much so for the PPI comparison, although there was perhaps a trend there. So we're also able to compare which group performs best. So this is the 4 groups: low PPI and aspirin, high PPI on its own, and high PPI with aspirin. The high PPI with aspirin is on the bottom, so there are fewer events, and the low PPI is on the top in green, and these were very significantly different. So just to summarize the results, the primary results, we don't want to overinterpret this. High-dose PPI shows some benefit compared to low. Aspirin shows some benefit compared to no aspirin. The statistical evidence was borderline for this, and the best treatment was high-dose PPI with aspirin compared to low-dose PPI alone. Secondary results, the strongest PPI evidence was for all-cause mortality analysis, and the strongest aspirin evidence was in high-grade dysplasia when censored for non-steroidal use. So just looking at the summary of other evidence, first of all for acid reflux and adenocarcinoma risk, there have been 2 meta-analyses. The figure there is the first one, which was published in Gut some 6 years ago, and this showed about a 70% reduction in high-grade dysplasia or adenocarcinoma, providing PPI was continued for at least 2 or 3 years, but they couldn't show a dose effect, and they didn't show an effect of H2 receptor antagonists. However, there was another meta-analysis 3 years later actually, which included 2 other large studies which, although again there was a trend, it wasn't significant. So there's some doubt about about PPIs. With aspirin, there were 2 meta-analyses from some time ago now which supported aspirin and NSAIDs reducing esophageal adenocarcinoma. So there was some good evidence from a reanalysis of the very large randomized trials of aspirin for vascular prophylaxis, showing that particularly for esophageal adenocarcinoma and colon cancer, providing it was continued for more than 5 years, there did appear to be a significant effect in chemoprevention. And this was even seen with the lowest doses of aspirin. But however, not all the case control studies support, and this is quite a large one from UK and Netherlands cohorts. So, first lessons from ASPECT. Are PPIs and aspirin chemopreventative? Well, unfortunately, we haven't really answered this question. There's some evidence that they may be, but it's not conclusive from our trial. But it does add to the available evidence. One curious thing is that we just showed an effect on high-grade dysplasia and not adenocarcinoma. I don't really have time to go over why that might be, but perhaps it will come out in questioning. Now, looking at tolerability and side effects and what's in the literature. First of all, for aspirin, this is a good systematic review which gives a baseline rate for GI bleeding of about 0.07% per year, higher actually if you're over 70, and this is increased by 1/3 to 2/3 with aspirin, but this is attenuated if you're also on a PPI. Intracranial hemorrhage, you'll see the rate is about half that of GI bleed, but is increased about 1/3 with aspirin. Moving on to PPIs, there are some what I've termed non-contentious side effects, such as infective diarrhea, CDT, magnesium deficiency, and there are some which I'm terming contentious, but I don't have time to go into that. But these are the ones that patients and GPs read about and flag up to us, such as cardiovascular, cerebrovascular risk, CKD, dementia, etc. So I'm just summarizing the ASPECT SAEs. They're in much more detail in the paper and in the supplements online. The total number of that should be SARs, so those are serious adverse reactions which were thought to be due to the agents, was 65 in 61 subjects. So that's around about 2.7% of the randomized patients. But the serious ones that required at least hospital admission, some form of intervention, were only about 1% of those randomized. If we look at the hemorrhagic adverse events, not all of these were attributed to the actual agents that were used in the trial, so they're just adverse events. There were 64 in 59 patients with 38 on aspirin and 21 not on aspirin, so about nearly double the amount in the aspirin ones. Only 20 of these, and that's less than 1% of all those randomized, had an intervention, and there were 7 who had a GI bleed requiring intervention, of which 4 were on aspirin. This shows the tolerability of aspirin. So on the top is the numbers of patients remaining on the randomized dose, that's in blue, over time up to 10 years. And you can see that there was an attrition, and in green and red, some of them went on to lower doses. That's on the low dose of PPI on the top, high dose PPI on the bottom. The reason why there's a sudden loss after 8 years is that not all the patients consented for further follow-up to 10 years. Only about, I think about 2/3 of them did. So the second lot of lessons from ASPECT are PPIs and aspirin safe? Well, high-dose PPIs do reduce all-cause mortality, and I've put in supplementary slides the actual detail of that, and that included cardiovascular, CNS, and psychiatric disorders, including dementia. So those were all reduced in the high-dose PPIs compared to low-dose PPIs, and particularly in combination with aspirin. Is aspirin safe? Well, from our data, obviously this isn't the hugest trial, but it does seem to be, providing PPIs are given, which is in keeping with the data I showed you from the systematic review. But it would be helpful to see if this is continued for longer follow-up, if we were able to do so. So finally, what's the optimal dose of PPI in Barrett's? And these are some studies from over the past 20 years or so, looking at 24-hour pH monitoring. The first one titrated lansoprazole either 15 or 30 milligrams a day to being free of symptoms, and you can see that 40% of patients by pH monitoring were inadequately suppressed. In the second study, omeprazole was used, and I think it's interesting that splitting the dose to twice a day reduced to about half the number with inadequate acid suppression. But if you increased it to 60 milligrams, less than 10% had inadequate acid suppression. And finally, the final study is in the dose that we used for our high dose regime, and none of them had inadequate acid suppression. So dose does matter. This is the tolerability of PPI in the two arms. On the top is the low dose PPI. And as you can see, 20 milligrams is in red, is the randomized dose. Quite a lot of them had to go on to a higher dose, in green, 40 milligrams. Whereas for the high dose PPI, most of them did continue on their randomized treatment. So the third lessons from ASPECT is what dose of PPI should be recommended for Barrett's patients. Well, I think we can definitely say from this trial it should be more than 20 milligrams of esomeprazole or equivalent per day. I think also that we can say that BD dosing from the other evidence I've shown you is likely to be best. And finally, don't be afraid to escalate the dose. We already do this in patients that we treat with dysplasia. But don't be afraid if you find on biopsies that there's inflammation within the Barrett's, that's likely to drive cancer. Don't be afraid to escalate to 80 milligrams a day. And from our studies, taking this for 9 or 10 years does appear to be safe. So very finally, where next? So Janusz Jankowski, my colleague, who really was the driving force behind Aspect, has been preparing a trial extension. This was submitted to CR UK last year, and they threw it out, but invited resubmission, which we have done, but everything's been put on hold at the moment. But the idea will be to extend follow-up by another 6 years, because evidence suggests that once you've had aspirin for 5 to 10 years, even if you're not using it anymore, the effect continues. And the questions will be, can we reduce adenocarcinoma as well as high-grade dysplasia? And will PPI and aspirin side effects become apparent after longer follow-up? Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We have one question here, which is based on the Aspect data and your experience, do you think aspirin 300 milligrams is safe for those over the age of 70 years?
Well, I've already shown you data suggesting that over the age of 70, the rate of GI bleed and also intracranial hemorrhages increases. So I'm not sure we can say that. I'm not sure that we need 300 milligrams. Obviously, Aspect wasn't looking at different doses of aspirin, but the other data that I presented showed there didn't seem to be a dose effect, and it may be, although this isn't conclusive, that 75 milligrams is enough.
John, one other question. So based on the data from this trial, what do you actually do in your practice with your patients?
Right, I don't put them on aspirin. Funnily enough, a lot of the patients who are in the trial have stayed on aspirin by their own choice, certainly in Leicester. All patients that I have who come up for Barrett's surveillance, whether they're symptomatic or not, automatically go on a minimum of 40 milligrams of omeprazole or esomeprazole split into BD. That's what I do. And if they have inflammation, they get ATBD, and I continue that.